Welcome to the Townsend Center for the Humanities. I'm Rebecca Egger, the Executive Director, and it's my pleasure to introduce Nathaniel Wolfson from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and Mark Goble from the Department of English for a discussion of Nathaniel's new book, Concrete Encoded: Poetry, Design, and the Cybernetic Imaginary in Brazil. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a couple of upcoming events. We'll be hosting a live stream only event that is part of the series A Book is Born, sponsored by our Art of Writing program. This series features conversations about the rich writerly and editorial collaborations that enable books to come into being. So on Monday, November 10th at 5 p.m., the co-authors of The End Doesn't Happen All at Once, a pandemic memoir, who happen to meet as graduate students in Berkeley's rhetoric department, will discuss their collaboration as writing partners and the story of how their recently published memoir came to be. You can access the live stream link for the event through the Townsend Center's website. And then on Wednesday, November 19th, we will have our final book chat of the semester when Mario Tello, who is here in the audience, discusses his new book, Roman Comedy Against the Subject, with colleague Dor Zhang. So it's my pleasure to hand things over to Nathaniel and Mark.
Oh, thank you all for coming. As will soon be apparent, I'm not an expert in Spanish or Portuguese, so there'll be some grisly Duolingo lessons going on here in real time. But it's been a fantastic opportunity to read Nathaniel's really great book, which is also an incredibly handsome and beautiful object, which I think is fitting for the material that it talks about too. So hopefully we all get a chance to look at it. I just wanted to ask Nathaniel first if you could just sort of very briefly say how this project came about, what drew you to these materials, and what was the kind of the course of the book as you brought it to this point.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for everyone for being here on this rainy day. The book came out yesterday officially, the same day that Mamdani was elected, so I was very pleased. I wanted to start with that.
Correlation is causation. I'm going to say.
Causation, as we learned. The answer that question is there's not a. It's kind of the process was quite random as these things go in a sense. I think I've often been asked like how I got into Brazilian literature to begin with, and this book, and for a long time I felt like. For sort of getting a job, I had to have an explanation in a sense that was somehow natural or even somehow related to belonging or some sort of familial relation. But actually a series of casual events brought me into studying Brazil, travel, language learning, and in early trips to Brazil as an undergrad, I encountered some of these objects, which are really visually, these concrete poems, visual poems that are really unusual and visually stunning, a lot of them. And I think I was just really allured by that. And then I began to be just interested in sort of some of the philosophy behind them as well. I think another pragmatic reason maybe is that as someone who is learning Portuguese, these poems are very succinct. They're often actually multilingual, and sometimes they just involve one word. And so I think perhaps I was attracted to that as a way of sort of just like legibility. And then the sort of audacity of this poetic form really appealed to me. And then the question of sort of the cybernetic came later, as this was a dissertation project, and I wanted to study this movement, concrete poetry, concrete art. And then I sort of, in the process of, in the archives, I think saw that that there was this convergence between cybernetics and cybernetic thought and this movement, both in Brazil and internationally. And so kind of led me there.
Right. Yeah, I want to make a question about the sort of the cybernetic part too. One of the really strong parts of the book's argument is being able to see how, thinking in our own sort of era of AI back to the digital, back to the a sort of origin story for a lot of contemporary technology sort of issues we're very familiar with. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about sort of, wind that story back and sort of what is specifically, what, for you, what do you think about as the specifically cybernetic, and then how does that get to the digital? How does that get to AI? What are some of the through lines, but then maybe what are some of the sort of the distinctions that you want to retain by thinking about this moment in particular around, the cybernetic as its own thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the word cybernetics, it's amorphous and capacious, and took a lot of effort to sort of track down what I was interested in about that concept. But historically, it's often understood as sort of a concept that united philosophers and engineers around concepts of control and automation, with far-ranging applications from psychiatry to robotics to military weapons, to management. But it also had this unorthodox interpretation within art and literature that was emerging at the same time. And so I think when I was writing the book and the manuscript, I wasn't consciously thinking how to relate the 1950s and 40s and 60s to the present moment. That became increasingly interesting to me as I was writing it. But I think the specificity of cybernetics in Brazil, that history and its relation to art and literature, does speak to our times in many ways. And I discussed that a little bit in the epilogue, not really explicitly in the book itself, right? But I think some of those obvious points are the relationship between power and authoritarianism and technology, which obviously we're thinking about so much now. In some of the figures in the book were producing their objects during a military dictatorship, when there was sort of a big investment in infrastructures of technology. Some of the figures, the scientists and engineers who installed the first computers at the universities in Brazil, were also involved in leftist politics, and the Communist Party were incarcerated. So there's that history. And then I think some of the figures in the book, not all of them, were really thinking specifically about algorithmically generated art and the beginnings of that. Generative aesthetics or uses of algorithms, and they were really interested in the value, the aesthetic value of that, what is possible, what is not possible in those objects. So I think that really speaks also to our moment as well.
That's a question, thinking about that aesthetic, the aesthetics around cybernetics. I mean, as you mentioned when you were sort of introducing the book, and one of the things, maybe we can look at some of the images from it. I mean, the images are beautiful. There's a kind of a aggressively aesthetic quality to a lot of the design elements and the way the work is done. And again, thinking about maybe I just have too much of a contemporary framework and sort of AI slop, and how there's almost a kind of sort of hatred of human aesthetic categories is so much part of sort of AI generated work. And sort of just, if you could talk more about what accounts for that sort of early sort of merging of the aesthetic and the technological. Was that something sort of particular to the cybernetic moment in the 50s? Did it come from some of the Brazilian figures and their own sort of intellectual sort of biographies and their interests? What accounts for that sort of strong sort of uniting of the aesthetic and the technological?
I think it's really hard for us now to remember the extent to which I put up a poem here. The extent to which there was a sort of a positive or utopian conception of the relationship between art and technology in the 1950s and 1960s. It's hard to grasp in our time. There was this idea of certain ideas of decentralization, self-organization, adaptation, that are concepts that are part of this, what I call cybernetic imaginary, were really appealing for artists and creative peoples. There's a kind of a strain of cybernetics, a kind of weird cybernetics that was taken up by psychiatrists, by anti-psychiatry movements. And there's a history of a more recent history of feminist science studies, for which cybernetics also served as a kind of impetus of thought. Figures like Sadie Plant or Sylvia Wynter or Donna Haraway were drawn to that. In Brazil specifically, I really am interested in the historical moment that gave rise to this technological desire or imaginary among artists that was also ambivalent. And throughout the book, I tracked that ambivalence. But the 1950s, as many people know, was a moment of transformation, of industrial transformation in Brazil. It was a period after 1945, a dictatorship ended, and there was a period of about 20 years or so until there was another military dictatorship. And in that time, there was a lot of kind of debate around technological industrialization, but there was a sense that the avant-garde artists of the time were associated or wanted to associate themselves with some of those projects, these modernizing projects like Brasilia, for example. A group of concrete poets based out of Sao Paulo had their manifesto. Their manifesto mimicked the name of the manifesto of Brasilia. So there's a convergence there that quickly became much more complicated, in part because of political changes that took place in the nation. But I sort of argue that from the beginning there was already an awareness of the possibility for cooptation in that desire.
Yeah, one of the really fascinating parts of the book is the way you trace various artists and individuals and their relationship to sort of institutions, universities, design schools, and then how they're kind of constantly sort of negotiating the relationship to the government as the government's sort of relationship to authoritarianism changes over the period. I just wonder if you could talk more about how that sort of triangulation works, how individuals, institutions, and the state kind of were sort of coming together and coming apart for some of these figures, just as a way of helping us sort of understand sort of post World War II Brazil and how these movements sort of fit to the story of sort of culture in this period.
Yeah, there's not like a single political position that I think each of the figures in the book ascribe to, and I kind of try to show a variation of ideological positions towards both culture and technology. The movement known as concrete poetry has sometimes been accused of being less politically motivated than other kinds of aesthetic traditions. So I tease out some of those dynamics. And so there's a range of relations between the state and the actors in the book. There is, for example, one chapter is on a woman, Mira Schendel, who was a refugee of World War II, a Jewish refugee who ended up coming to Brazil and sort of has a kind of distant relationship from the political environment. But another chapter involves a designer who was also an artist who became involved in cultural politics and the politics of patrimony and conservation during the military regime. So there's a wide spectrum and of positions there. But the general period that I'm looking at is one that shows like a shift from democratization to an authoritarian regime. By the end of the book, it's sort of the opening of this regime towards democracy again. But the idea is to kind of show a large trajectory there.
Right. Well, another question that came to me, particularly because I'm a modernist, but based mainly U.S. literature and Anglo-American literature, is the way the different geographies that the book opens up, especially in thinking about the period from the 50s to the 70s, when we think about sort of international art capitals, New York, London, Paris, kind of competing for dominance in a sort of the claim on sort of modernism after World War II, to sort of introduce us to different cities, different networks. Not just in Brazil, but then between Brazil and West Germany, Brazil and sort of other nations as well. what what sort of came to you as you were thinking about the book and the material, about sort of understanding sort of this period in the 50s and 70s, really from the global South, and how does on the one hand, because they're very much claiming the same kind of modernist aesthetic in many terms, but coming from a different geography, different histories that come into the work. I just wonder if what changes when we think about the global South as sort of the center of a kind of modernism.
For sure. Well, I think I'd start by saying that the concrete poetry movement, which is really one part of this study, tends to be located in the southeast of the country, in Sao Paulo and in Rio. But at the same time, it was sort of considered itself perhaps Brazil's first global aesthetic movement, in as much as it was so connected to other avant-garde movements at the time through magazines that were shared, exhibitions, international exhibitions, travels. So there was that sort of self-conscious internationalization, both within the global South. For example, Haroldo de Campos, who's one of the figures in the book, had collaborated with poets and thinkers in Mexico City through El Corno Emplumado, which was a magazine. But at the same time, there were relations also between Europe and Asia. An important node for me in the book is West Germany. I began the book actually by studying the correspondence, or part of the first sort of archival move was studying the correspondences between Haroldo de Campos and a German philosopher of technology, Max Benze, who was based out of Stuttgart, who was a very prolific critic who theorized cybernetics and was really obsessed with Brazil, and in a lot of senses projected a lot of his ideas of a sort of cybernetic future onto Brazil. And I think quite ingeniously, Haroldo de Campos used that relationship in a sense to propagate and to expand Brazilian concrete poetry, but also was quite critical in his own writings and his translations and commentary of Benze's, in some ways, techno sort of ideas of techno essentialism in a certain way, or especially this projection onto Brazil, this as being a sort of a place in which to transpose his theories. So I think there is that double gesture of desire for expansion, but also a kind of self-consciousness that's present throughout, concerns about ideas of technological transfer. Obviously, Brazil is not a center of power or technology. So there's always the question of reception, whether it be of technological ideas or objects, was part of debate at the time. I should also say, I think that I thought the book is sort of constructed around a group of figures that are in conversation with one another. And I thought a lot about the word network and how that was the term that seemed most likely to me to use to describe this this group that was, I should also say, not just, I tried to expand beyond the southeast coordinates of Brazil to include artists and writers from other parts of the nation to sort of work against the story that this modernist moment only belongs to the southeast, but also in terms of the international relations they had. But I found that it didn't feel correct to use that term, partly because of a sort of anachronism that wasn't so much in their own vocabulary, but also there were critics at the time in Brazil, thinkers, for example, a geographer named Milton Santos, who wrote against the idea of using a term like network in Brazil, which has a sort of, is often thought of as about the distribution of power. A network has a kind of distribution or non-centralized power, but if you think about technology and technological transfer, that's not really how it's functioned, how technologies actually, as part of capitalist developmentalism, are implemented in the global south. So I ended up using a term, circle of figures, the circle, which allowed me to think a little about circulation, but also the idea of a kind of restricted group of people that often desired more circulation than they were able to in the global sphere than they were really able to achieve. and in that sense, I borrowed, or I thought with Raymond Williams, whose essay, The Bloomsbury Faction, talks about the idea of a faction as opposed to as a specific kind of way of thinking about a group dynamic.
When you were talking about circulation there and sort of the desire for circulation, I was thinking about your last chapter on the designer whose name I will not venture to pronounce, but you can correct me, but Magalhães.
Magalhães.
Yeah, I see, exactly. Because here, a logo designer,
Yeah.
you can maybe show the logo for Rio's, and then where in some ways the problem or the really fascinating sort of trajectory you traced in that chapter is just how much circulation there is then from this logo with its very kind of, clean, sort of pristine, sort of to then the way it's sort of drawn and sort of scrolled on and ends up sort of on graffiti and on sort of sidewalks and sort of reused and reappropriated. So I love those in particular. That kind of, so we go from the sort of cybernetic back to the kind of handmade in various ways. How does one way of what that chapter especially made me think about was how in what ways did these sort of art projects in some ways very kind of coterie sort of gallery culture projects then sort of become part of sort of Brazilian popular culture in different ways. I mean, obviously this is the most striking example, but there's other moments where these figures are really sort of talking to sort of the idea of popular culture in a kind of technological sense too. Sort of maybe around this logo or some other figures where you see those interactions taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I unplugged it. So yeah, that is a through line and a tension throughout the book is the how an avant-garde movement that's attached to abstract traditions and global modernist traditions sees itself as Brazilian and part of a kind of popular culture, and partly that question emerged for some of these figures because of critique that they faced as being elitist forms and not in touch with more popular kinds of aesthetic production, which caused them to then think about these questions. In this particular instance, in this chapter, the chapters are sort of about individuals, and this chapter is Aloysio, and he was from the northeast of Brazil, from Recife, sort of outside of that area from which concretism was born. He started off as a painter, and he ended up becoming a designer of logos. He got a State Department grant to go to the United States, and became really interested in the sort of corporate culture around branding and logos, communication. And then in Brazil, when he returned to Brazil, sort of moved from being a visual artist to a designer, and designer in the sense of logos, of visual identities, of banks. He redesigned the currency of Brazil. He was one of Brazil's most well-known designers, and he was commissioned in particular to design the logo for Rio's 4th centenary celebration in 1964, which obviously prescribes to a kind of concretist aesthetic in its abstraction. The colors refer to places, to Brazil, to the nation, to the city, but and there was a lot of tight control around the reproduction of the design. There was a commission that paid for it, and it was supposed to be restricted for official objects related to the design. But he became really interested in how the design sort of circulated within the city of Rio de Janeiro, and these different spaces was reappropriated and kind of took on a life of its own by different kinds of artists, scenographers, carnival. This is a carnival celebration. You see the logo on the side, on top of the float, on wagons, and on as graffiti. And then he began he took these photographs himself, and he wrote about the sort of what he called the life of the sign, and he drew on cybernetic theory to think about this sign that generates itself. But that became a catalyst for him thinking about the relationship between design and popular culture in general. And he's someone who actually ended up his politics sort of shifted, and he became increasingly embedded in the dictatorship over time, actually. So it's a complicated figure. So his idea of design, he has an idea of the designer as kind of the spokesperson for the people that tap into a kind of collective unconscious through these logos or symbols that represent the people. And he ended up working for the state in this patrimony and cultural governance. And sort of that idea expands.
Yeah. Maybe a last question before we open it up, and it's sort of a methodological question, and you can kind of get the sense from some of the images that you've shown so far is that you reflected, Nathaniel reflects at a couple points in the book about how he's interested in artists, and I'll just quote you here, that are producing works where to read these works is to ask for a reading practice that's closer to pattern recognition and visual analysis than traditional literary criticism. The kind of, close readings you would do of some, the close reading you would do of a John Donne sonnet, different skill set is required for a poem like that. And even when we were talking about the logo, again, I mean, we're sort of familiar with, it looks like Sol LeWitt. I mean, you can kind of work by analogy, but again, it's not the Raft of Medusa where you're going to do sort of heavy iconographic symbolic reading. So I'm just curious, how did you, but on the other hand, you do produce readings of these works in sort of all sorts of different ways. So how did that sort of work for you, sort of reading these things, with that kind of expertise and the kind of intellectual histories you bring to them, but then also, how you were managed to do close readings of works that themselves at least are programmatically sort of said to resist a kind of, standard, old-fashioned hermeneutic approach.
Yeah, I love that question, and I think I'm now reflecting backwards on how I did or didn't achieve a certain kind of reading. But so this is sort of the beginning of the book, and it's the clearest example of a poem that's cybernetic because, according to a close friend of the poet who made this, the poet was sort of designed to show a feedback mechanism in a way that a pattern is established in order to maintain a pattern with the introduction of an additional RA that we won't decode the poem right now, but a poem like that's ostensibly designed to be a pattern sort of calls for a particular kind of reading that for these poets at the time, they were really interested in, as you said, breaking with a kind of traditional mode of reading poetry. They even sort of played with the idea of what we call today cultural analytics, which is sort of using quantification strategies or techniques to read literature or read culture, often for sort of formal attributes, and quantify them and find patterns and find and so they were interested in that as a kind of radical critique of a kind of traditional literary mode. I definitely don't do any kind of cultural analytics in this book, and so one could argue that I'm kind of not following the directives of the poets themselves by reading, in some cases, for meaning historically through the archive. But one thing that I think I did do was treat the objects as visual art objects in a lot of cases, so borrowing some approaches from other disciplines in the literary fields by thinking a lot about the ways in which the objects were produced technically. I talk a lot about the typewriter, about printing, about the sort of process in which these were constructed, and then the context around that and how the artists and the authors themselves were theorizing themselves as makers and makers of technology and their own processes of, in some cases, extremely handmade, but they sort of made relations between that handmade process and a technological or cybernetic process. So that was a way I think that I was breaking away maybe from some traditional hermeneutic approaches by talking about the fabrication process and even the social relations around that process.
Yeah, no, it's a great mix of interpretive strategies that are sort of done across the book. I'd like to open it up for questions from you guys have about any parts of Nathaniel's book or the things that we've been talking about so far. Well, we've got some time.
These questions are hard.
Yeah.
Conversation. Nathaniel, I'm interested in since you're like tracing this evolution of the concrete movement. I've always admired the work of Nathaniel Wolfson as this person who kind of sort of connects the classical, generation of this concrete poets, say that knowledge and practices into other types of media. How do you conceptualize his role in this story that you're this narrative represents?
Yeah, I would say that he belongs to a contemporary generation that's been reconciling with the legacies of these movements, and I should say that that there was a period in time that I think that this aesthetic became out of fashion in Brazilian literature, especially in the 1980s. There was sort of like a return to a more traditional lyric, sometimes a kind of confessional lyric, not necessarily a traditional poetic form, but one that is obviously in not necessarily in opposition, but distinct from the kinds of work that's being done here. But along that whole period, there was also there was also a group of sort of more radical avant-garde artists and poets that were interested in maintaining the tradition. And as I think you're alluding to, that the question of translation and intermediality is something that was really present in these works, or in the movement to begin with, sort of the relationship between poetry, the visual arts, music, collaborations, between Tropicalia artists and concrete poets, versions of concrete poems by Caetano Veloso, exhibitions that displayed paintings beside poems. And so new media artists in sort of the 1980s who were interested in video or the relationship between different medias were inspired by some of these works and continued the dialogue. So I would say that sort of question of translation and between media in his work and Antunes's work speaks to how in contemporary artists have sort of drawn on the legacies of concretism, in as much as new media continues to be an ongoing theme in Brazilian art. There's also the movement known as neo-concretism, which is is more well known internationally than concretism. There's artists like Lygia Clark and Elio Chisica, Lygia Papi. These are major figures in global art practices. Those they were embedded in this tradition, but were critical of some of the sort of what appeared to be and what was in certain cases a sort of rationalist, a sort of rationalism in especially the early concrete poems, the control that one sees in the kind of mathematization of a poem. And the neo-concrete tradition sort of continues to live on in contemporary art today. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for this. This is really interesting. But I wonder if I could ask, or invite you to talk a little bit more about concreteness and the cybernetic, and how they're thinking about that. I'm thinking about sort of recent turns in scholarship to think about hardware and how that relates to the cybernetic and sort of the illusion of dematerialized digital culture. And are they thinking about that tension? You were talking about the handmadeness of some of these objects. How are they relating to that, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is like a really interesting convergence between the handmade and the sort of abstractness of these works that I think makes them really interesting to think about.
That question makes me think of
Yeah.
some of the sections of the book. I think it was with Cabral talking about sort of the influence of typesetting.
Yeah.
That kind of the way his poetry
Yeah.
sort of works differently. You can sort of see the legacy of sort of the manual labor of typesetting.
Yeah.
Or with Stendhal with the sort of the turn to acrylic, where you sort of introduce this big, heavy, classically sort of modern material, and then it sort of affects the kind of art she was doing. So there's a couple of, so I can think of some scenes in the book where that question's really sort of coming, materialized.
Yeah, thank you for that, for saying. And the question is great. It makes me, I'm sort of hard to figure out like where to begin with it. I think one of the things I was interested in was looking at poets and artists that were not necessarily using technology in the sense that we often conceive of it, but are still thinking about their work technologically, right? So only a few of the examples in the book, I tinkered with computers in a way. They used early computers to generate poems and art, but the majority of the figures were not doing that. In the third chapter, I discuss a poet named Joao Cabral, who was interested in types. He typeset his own poems. He got a letterpress machine, and and that process of printing his own works made him think about poetic process as a kind of prosthetic process, and that's he thought about the machine of the typographic machine as a kind of an extension of his body in the production of this work that made him think about the concept of prosthesis in a bigger way. And I draw on that chapter on an idea by Stiger, the French theorist of grammatisation, which is this idea that there is a process, a long process in sort of the history of writing of writing becoming more discrete, and a kind of exteriorization from human experience that writing creates. A kind of externalization of the human in technologies of writing that culminates in our moment, but we can see that as part of a longer history of writing. And so his process of typesetting and imagining himself as kind of not necessarily a cyborg, but there's a kind of prosthetic operation happening, brings to mind for him as he's sort of discreetly putting together the poem bit by bit by having to understand how to use these blocks as writing is broken down into these pieces and sort of discretized. And that then allows him to think about the broader technological moment that he's in, where these cybernetic technologies are actually unfolding quite quickly. So there's that sort of relationship between hardware and the abstraction of language into bits and pieces that we see increasingly with artificial intelligence and different ways of mapping and of conceiving of language in bits and pieces. I think it's on, but just.
But I was curious, when I saw this work, I think the first Sao Paulo biennial was earlier in the 1950s, maybe like 2. And so I was just curious about how at the moment where Brazil was also kind of like gaining this globalized visual arts infrastructure, about how that would affect the figures that you're talking about in terms of the like circle of figures or the network.
Yeah.
You talked about how there were exchanges with cybernetic theorists elsewhere, but I was curious about other visual arts infrastructure, how that contributed.
Yeah, for sure. I think they emerge completely sort of in tandem with one another. The first exhibition of this group that was called Noi Gambades. It was a magazine, but it was also a sort of team of poets two brothers, the Gicampos brothers, Decio Pignatari, and then others joined as well. Their first public display of their poems was in poster forms in an exhibition on concrete painting in Rio de Janeiro. That moved to Sao Paulo. So from the very beginning, there's a dialogue and an exchange between the two media, and you're right to bring up the Sao Paulo biennials as being the moments in which, especially in painting, the concrete art tradition, which is sort of this geometric abstract tradition, is displayed. And it's also a moment when there are these international convergences. Sometimes there were debates in the public sphere around whether one should compare the concrete poetry to concrete painting. There's a really interesting curator and critic, Mario Pedraza, who wrote an essay making the claim that poems should not be, that the concrete poems were actually much more expressive, and he claimed, I think kind of almost in a sort of Lessian classical way of thinking of these media differently in terms of their capacities for expression, painting versus writing. He wanted to separate them. And actually, Haroldo de Campos wrote a response in a journal saying that he disagreed that the poems were like the paintings. They were both trying to achieve this sort of they were both conceived mathematically like an engineer. And so kind of going against this expressive reading of the poems at the time. And this is the moment, sort of the highest point of what's sometimes called orthodox concretism, where the ideas are the most radical in their, they will change over time.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. Hello, first of all, thank you for coming out today, for your time and your energy. We spent a lot of time talking about the 1950s and cybernetics, but you did mention Tropicalia in the 1970s, and I couldn't help but be reminded of works like, say, Construção, where a lot of the lyricism is spoken through imagery and through musical motif to kind of bypass government censorship. And I was wondering if Brazilian concrete poetry and Tropicalia have any commonalities in regards to government censorship.
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's so many interesting convergences between concrete poetry and Tropicalia, and that Construção Gilberto Gil, right? No, who is it? It's Shigawaki, excuse me, big mistake. That speaks to it's a poem that very much speaks to the side of zeitgeist of construction, of Brasilia, one could argue, but also in its poetic construction as a lyric, is doing something really, really playful and imaginative. Buarque's Construção, you brought up. Gilberto Gil was in my mind because he was another singer of MPB or Tropicalia, was incarcerated for some time, and wrote songs, one called Cibernética, Behind Bars, and another related poem that I briefly discuss. The question of censorship is sort of central to Brazilian countercultural aesthetics in the 1960s, 1970s, for sure. And Caetano Veloso went to London, and Gil went to London, escaping the dictatorship. The figures that I look at, the concrete poets, were not persecuted to the same degree. But one poet, João Cabral, who I write about, was removed from his diplomatic post. He was a diplomat, and he was a diplomat in Barcelona, and he was accused of communist sympathies and was removed from his post and had to go back to Brazil. But that was actually before the dictatorship. That was in the 1950s, in this ostensibly democratic moment of Brazil. So also sometimes what I try to do also is show that the politics are not so clearly defined by dictatorship, post or pre-dictatorship, that there was persecution and censorship of progressive artists at other moments in Brazil as well, and of course during the dictatorship too.
Hello. Hi, Nathaniel. Thank you. So about the term network not being appropriate to describe the circulation of cybernetic technologies in the global south. I wondered if you could just expand a little bit more on why it might be necessary to draw that distinction, and if they propose a separate terminology or system to describe that circulation, what is it?
Yeah, thank you, Isaac. I didn't find them specifically discussing that topic, sort of living out these relations and modes of circulation, but not giving a name to it. Milton Santos, who was a geographer who thought a lot about infrastructure, technological systems in the global south, and the sort of translations of those concepts and practices, took opposition to the term concept as much as it applies to the term network, as much as it applies to the global south. But the idea of the group of figures is my own, but there is one example, Mira Schendel, the artist that I discuss in the book. She was really self-reflexive on the kinds of communication that she was establishing with other artists, and in sort of ways that recall other kinds of conceptual artists of the 1970s, was really interested in her own participation in networks and circulation. Mark mentioned these sort of uses of transparent materials. Her works, she kind of these sculptural works that were made using transparencies or plexis to kind of hold in place pieces of paper, usually made from rice paper, in which she had various kinds of citations of different kinds of things she was reading at the time, or figures she was in contact with, that she would retype their works and their writings and then kind of place them within these plexi containers, and people could circulate around them. She displayed these works at the Venice Biennial in 1967, and then at other places. And the idea was sort of circulating around these works, these objects that actually were transparent, but they created opacities as well, because you would look through multiple objects at once, and sort of what she was reading and who her friends were and the contents of her everyday experience became sort of illegible as you were circulating this environment. So she was definitely interested in reflecting on this question of friendship and communication. And she's one example of the book where I sort of argue that technologies of communication are actually producing a sense of isolation for many of these figures, that they're interested in how, despite the access that they have to telephones, for example, in her case, especially the telephone, she feels increasingly isolated in her everyday life. So there's a kind of reflection on that mode of sociality, although she doesn't give it a particular name to describe that network.
That's fascinating. It seems very prescient. Thank you.
I think we're
ready.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you so
for your
much.
questions, and thank you to Nathaniel for writing such a great book.
Thank you so much.